Hello, this is Tashida-San Recap. This video is called Garo Vanishing Line. Full episodes with a powerful MC. Sword the protagonist, also known as Garo the Golden Knight. Sword destroys a horror that has been killing people, causing considerable destruction in the process. Sophie is currently 13 years old and is desperate to find clues about her brother Martin, who went missing 3 years ago. She receives an invite from the fortune teller, Moon Wizard. When she found him, the two went into a divination session and he eerily knew about her situation. However, he revealed himself to be the demon beast Obsession, a horror with a particular taste for ginger girls, and tries to eat Sophie. But Sword arrives to protect her from harm and Obsession escapes, leaving Sword looking for a way to get him out of hiding. At the diner, Sophie has a quick crash course on the Makai world and Sword needs to use her as bait to lure Obsession out. Although scared, Sword promises she won't be harmed and drew Obsession out into open combat. In an explosive battle, Garo successfully defeats Obsession and Sophie develops an immediate curiosity towards Sword as it is the first real clue she had about Martin after all this time. Following massive damage to a city bridge during Sword's battle with a horror, Makai Alchemist Luke used his magical bullet to create an instant rain that will magically erase everything that has happened during the night. At the diner, Sword was having his usual large round steak with extra large mound of ketchup-drenched fries when Luke expressed his irritation at his inability to keep things quiet. Sword tries to explain that there were circumstances and it involved Sophie, but that only made things worse as civilians aren't supposed to be involved in their matters. Sword points out that Luke's own responses are a bit cold and lacks heart. Too irritated to stand Sword's presence, Luke unhappily leaves the diner. Sophie was picked up by the police as she's a minor near the explosion. Taken to the hospital, an office watched over her until her guardian, sister of the Catherine Home Orphanage, came to pick her up. Sister wasn't pleased with Sophie's actions, but was lenient on Sophie since it was about her search for Martin. Excited to have a clue about Martin, Sophie accidentally bumps into a black couple, Hardy and Anif. Sophie apologizes for bumping into them and runs off, not knowing Hardy will become the next horror. Hardy was once an Olympic gold medalist that became paralyzed after saving his girlfriend, Anif, from a falling sign. He pushed her away to save her, but the sign fell on him, causing spinal damage, paralyzing and confining him to a wheelchair. Embittered that he can never run again, the demon beast began sensed his anguish and offered him the power to run again and he took it. Hardy was happy to have his legs back, but it also made him into a demon beast. In his demonic form, he would devour unsuspecting victims and use his unrivaled speed to escape detection from the Makai Order. To prepare for Begin, Luke entered the city slums where Begin frequents and set up magical traps through the area. He bumped into Anith looking for Hardy, but he didn't want to talk to her. Sword arrived to listen to her story and assured to help her search for him. Before walking away, Luke advised Sword to direct the horror into the slums for a controlled battle if Begin appears. Anith made it back to Hardy's apartment when she found Hardy miraculously able to walk again. While he was expressing his joy, he also mentioned how his hunger can't be satiated. In a fit of raging hunger, Hardy turned into Begin and tried to devour Anith when Sword intervened. Escaping out of the window, Garo gave chase and engaged Begin in melee combat with the help of Saruba and his motorcycle. Luke's magical trap activated as Begin ran through the slums. A magical barrier appeared to limit Begin's movement and Luke used his sniper gun to stop him. Luke shot Begin in the leg and head. Garo finished Begin off by running him over with his ride. In the aftermath, Luke used his magical rain to erase every one of their memories that night, including a devastated Anif. Due to the magical rain, Anith had forgotten Hardy's demise and starts the day again looking for him, not realizing he's already gone. The following day at the diner, Chiaki sends Garm's compliments for good teamwork. However, Luke wasn't receptive of the compliments and even irritated at Sword picking off from his plate. Later, Makai Alchemist Gina Evans attempted to break into the compound of a Damien steward, but it was too heavily guarded. To successfully break into Damien's HQ, she literally ran into Sword while he was giving thanks to a prostitute as her rough way of asking for help. At a bar lounge, Sword wanted to say thanks to Gina's breasts when her spirit beast, Mia, came out to attack Sword for his perverted ritual. Gina then reviews about Damien's unusual fast rise from local street thug to gang boss and CEO of a company. To rise this fast requires the aid of great computational power and Gina suspects there's a horror behind it but haven't able to confirm. Sword though Gina was there to get his help, but she enticed him to team up when she mentioned the computation source might be able to lead him to El Dorado. During a syndicate meeting, the gang members talked about the threat of Damien and his aggressive profiting tactics into their operations. It was then the entire group was gunned down by Damien. Taking a surviving member of the slaughter, Damien showed his members the secret to his rise, Demon Beast Aggregate. The horror developed a symbiotic relationship with Damien. Whenever Aggregate is hungry, he'll provide Damien a means to rise in power for human meals. Gina and Sword are heading to his highly secured penthouse to confirm their suspicions. At the penthouse, Gina disguised herself as a beautiful seductress to distract Damien and obtain his DNA. His security systems uses his DNA as the access code, and while Sword infiltrates the systems, Gina will enter the data room to assist Sword. Unfortunately, Damien caught Gina snooping around and she pretended to be a victim from the scary man in the monitor, Sword, who supposedly told her to do as she was told. Sword made it to Aggregate's room and everyone thought he would be devoured, but Garo fought and destroyed the horror. Back at the lounge, Gina and Sword learned that Damien was killed in the aftermath. Although Damien survived the rage of Aggregate, without his partner's computation abilities, he failed to anticipate a revenge killing and was gunned down by the Syndicate. Gina assured her return if there was ever an interesting assignment and stiffed Sword with her tab. Later, Sophie found the diner that Sword had taken her when they first met. However, Chiaki wasn't cooperative in helping her find Sword. She wanted to stay and wait for him, but was told she had to be a paying customer or asked to leave. Desperate for money to see Sword, she attempts to get money from Sister while in a judo lesson with her. Although Sister senses it has something to do with Martin's case, she didn't give Sophie the money as it's considered a luxury. Focusing her efforts elsewhere, Sophie found Marie Ripley, the younger sister to missing father Thomas Ripley. It was while visiting Marie that Sword also appeared. He was apparently trying woo Marie with flowers and left. Sophie gave chase, but couldn't catch up with Sword in his bike. While having dinner with Marie, it is revealed that she is the horror Rangrian. Father Ripley apparently had either incestuous feelings or found sexual gratification in causing pain towards his sister. Marie has been hiding as a recluse beauty all this time. Sword appeared and saved Sophie and engaged Rangrian in combat. With Sophie's drop the church's bell to distract Rangrian long enough for Garo to cut her down. In the aftermath, Sword wonders why Sophie wants to know about El Dorado so badly, and she explained about her brother's disappearance. She needs Sword's help to find Martin. Realizing their paths are the same, Sword agreed to help Sophie. Chiaki was about to ask Sophie to leave as usual, but Sophie brings out money and buys a glass of juice, leaving Chiaki no choice but to let her stay since she is now a paying customer. Sword arrives to the diner, and before Sophie can talk to him, Gina approaches Sword and suddenly asks him, "Will you marry me?" The three of them then go undercover as the Brown family to Lady Viola's mansion, where top-class parents who don't care about their children leave them for Lady Viola to educate. Gina explains that Lady Viola was an actress that did not stand out, but suddenly she raised to the top while her rivals were getting injured or became part of scandals. Gina also tells them that there are rumors that say that Lady Viola is using rings to control horrors and do her binding. While Lady Viola seduces Sword, Gina and Sophie search the rooms where the kids stayed and find the diary of one of them. The diary states that the rumors about Lady Viola were true and that she used demons to eat the souls of the children, leaving them as mindless dolls. After reading this, they find a secret passage underground which leads them to a blood circle for a summoning ritual. Lady Viola then appears before them and uses her cats to attack, but Gina creates an explosion and reveals the truth. Lady Viola did indeed summon a horror, but her rings were not authentic, causing the horror to possess her instead. Lady Viola then changes into the horror Sarabi and fights Sophie and Gina, but they stall long enough for Sword to come and slay Sarabi. It's 11 AM and Sword has yet to wake up. Meifeng had to use a gong to force Sword to wake up. Sword has been staying at Fei Long's Chinese restaurant in Russell City's Chinatown. Borderline freeloading, his only payment is to make meals for the opening crew. Outside the place is retired Makai Alchemist Fei Long. Sword just made his rare Golden Knight special fried rice for Fei Long to eat, but he wasn't impressed for a guy can't wake himself up. Sword explained he sleeps deep and he's still not wrinkly yet. Fei Long is insulted that the Golden Knight would judge him superficially, but Sword challenged him to come out of retirement. Irritated at the conversation, Fei Long tells Sword to see if there's food from his master. At the diner, Sword finds Luke having a sandwich alone and barged in to chat with him. Things got awkward when Sophie entered the door and Sword attempted to exit their conversation. However, Luke wanted to talk to Sword about Sophie, but Sword denies knowing Sophie, despite her calling him by name and wondering if Luke is also a knight. While Sophie goes to play some darts, Luke wonders why is she involved in their affairs as she knows too much, but Sword reasons there are circumstances behind it. Luke feels Sword's actions are putting Sophie in danger and wants to erase her memories, but Luke was surprised to find out Sophie is connected to El Dorado. Luke realizes this debate is pointless and decides to leave in frustration. Sophie wants to get to know Sword better and wondered where he lived, but he didn't want to answer her, including Zaruba. At the Chinese restaurant, getting drunk with some customers, Sword overhears rumors of a movie theater with missing people. However, during the chat, Sophie placed a hidden tracker into Sword's pocket and found out where he works and lives. The girl got too overly curious when she realized Sword had a sister and didn't feel like talking about it. Sword realized he made things awkward and offered to give her some gyoza and take her home afterwards. The following day, at the diner, Luke got the assignment to investigate the movie theater Sword heard about earlier. Unfortunately, after a night's investigation, no one has been revealed to be a horror and he has to return and sweep the theater again. Meanwhile, Sophie's constant visits somehow got her to work at the Chinese restaurant for Fei Long, and Mei Feng loves her energy. Fei Long reflected with Sword that Luke hasn't gotten much luck in figuring out the mysterious disappearances of people. Sophie overhears their situation and decides to probe the chat sites to see if anyone have heard anything. Through her inquiries, she discovered that the victims disappear at row L, seat 13. While at the theater, Luke accidentally found the right seat on his own. When he lost contact with the order, Sword got worried and investigated into the matter. Remember what Sophie said about the seat? He stabbed the seat to reveal the entire theater is a horror in disguise, demon beast on Umbra. Sword found Luke reliving his most precious memories of his childhood. Sword had to snap him back to reality to remind him his mother is dead. Awakened from his dream state, Luke went into action and the two slayed the horror. In the aftermath, Luke swore to return a favor to him and Sword credited Sophie for his save. At the rooftop of a building, Pawn eats an unsuspecting woman named Melia Wild, who agreed on the terms of El Dorado and was ready to work for them. Luke and Sword discuss about people that are going missing. One of them left a message to his friend mentioning El Dorado. This causes Sword to storm out and orders Sophie not to follow him. Elsewhere, Knight is held at gunpoint by two thugs. Luke and Sword go to the house of the friend to investigate, later finding out that all the missing people were people who had few or no one at all to look for them and that they were people related to the internet. Meanwhile, Sophie looks into the net and finds out that a group of gamers also disappeared. She also learns where the leader can be found at. She tries to sneak out from the orphanage, but is found out by Sister. However, she manages to escape when Sister turns around for a while. Shortly after Sophie escapes, Pawn presents himself to Sister. In a police station, an officer finds Knight looking at Sophie's file at the police archive. Sophie brings the information to Sword, who eventually goes with Luke to a warehouse. Luke and Sword find the hostages unconscious, but Sword suddenly notices that Sophie's address is marked in a map and quickly runs. Luke requests for help, but Chiaki turns him down, saying they are in a situation right now that something crazy is wandering around. Sister was about to tell the orphans about Pawn's paid field trip, but Pawn rings the doorbell, and when Sister opens the door, he tells him that they have to go now. Feeling something is wrong, Sister fights Pawn and tells Sophie to take the orphans to Mr. Brooks. Sophie returns to the orphanage and sees Pawn's horror form picking up an impaled Sister. Pawn was about to hurt Sophie, but Knight appears and kills him. Sister holds Knight's leg and tells Sophie to run, causing him to fatally stab her. Knight then says that his master summoned Sophie while spraying Sister's blood from his blade towards her. A newly traumatized Sophie was about to fall in shock, but Sword arrives and picks her up. Knight rhetorically asks Garo, when suddenly Luke shoots from a nearby rooftop. Knight cuts the bullet in two and causes an explosion behind him. Luke says that the Dark Knight finally appears. Luke confronts Knight and they both engage in a fierce battle. During the battle, Luke flashbacks back when the Dark Knight was still his master and the day Knight killed Luke's mother. Luke is eventually outmatched by Knight's strength and gets impaled by his Bicento. Knight then drops an injured Luke from a rooftop and then his Bicento. Zaruba drives the motorcycle out from the windows of the building and rescues Luke before Knight's Bicento can strike him. Sword then attacks Dark Knight and they both summon their Makai armor and start battling. Meanwhile, Fei Long's people are setting up magical barriers around the city to limit the destruction. As Mei Feng takes Sophie to a safe underground shelter, they are intercepted by a horror and then a swarm of them, but Mei Feng manages to defeat all of them with just a magic talisman. The battle between the knights quickly escalates and many buildings are destroyed. As the destruction nears to the end, Sword and the Dark Knight fight with their bare fists. Sword eventually defeats Knight, who tells him to sharpen his blade as he will return. Sister's funeral takes place in the aftermath of Sword and Knight's fight. Sword eats at Luke's apartment because the construction noises won't let him eat peacefully at his house. Luke is alive, but his body sustained grave injuries and is heavily bandaged. Sword heads out to the diner, where he is given instructions to head west with Sophie in search of El Dorado and its king. They are expected to meet up with additional Makai Alchemists at San Del Dios. Sword and Sophie travel through the countryside beyond the city. They come across a wounded deer and Sophie insists on stopping in order to help it. Sophie then realizes how much she misses sister. Meanwhile in El Dorado, Knight is criticized by the other members of El Dorado for his failure while they await Sword's impending arrival. Luke stands in the rain amidst the ruins of destroyed skyscrapers while recalling his confrontation with Knight. In the ruins, firefighters help rescue the injured civilians and uplift paranoid people, who thought the destruction was due to a terrorist attack. At night, Luke gets frustrated and trashes his apartment. Mayfin comes and bandages the still healing cuts of Luke. A couple is then shown running away from two horrors. Fortunately, Luke kills the horrors from a long distance. At dawn, a firefighter impatiently requests for help because a child is trapped under the debris. The firefighter then asks for a nearby stranger to help, but the stranger starts asking questions about the girl before revealing his horror form and trying to eat the firefighter. The horror is shot down by Luke, who then proceeds to help rescue the girl by using a street sign to raise the debris. The firefighter starts crying because the girl is not moving, but his superior arrives and tells him not to give up. The superior then performs CPR and effectively resuscitates the girl. At Fei Long's restaurant, Luke has a talk with Fei Long, but he tells him that he came to the wrong place if he was looking for advice. People gather around the memorial of the people who died during the city's destruction, with police patrolling and announcing a memorial ceremony held tomorrow at noon. At the diner, Chiaki thanks Luke for his patronage and tells him that they will soon have him leave towards El Dorado. While packing up, Luke recalls his first horror hunt and the night his father stepped off into darkness and killed his mother. At the memorial ceremony, Luke sees the same firefighter from the other day crying over his superior, who died valiantly trying to save people from a collapsing building. But the girl they saved came and thanked him, causing the firefighter to burst into tears. After seeing that, Luke is reminded of his mother's dying words, that strength is not for yourself, but for others. Luke then entrusts the safety of the city to Fei Long before setting foot towards El Dorado. While Phil misinforms Natalia about Sword being a serial kidnapper and the responsible for a police shootout. While Phil also informs her that Sword is coming to their town and that he is briding a girl with him. Arriving at a tavern, Sword and Sophie are greeted and then treated by the locals, who tell the history about their town and Phil. Sophie and Natalia go to the restroom, but when Sophie comes out, Natalia takes her outside and tries to put her inside Phil's patrol car. Sophie yells Sword, but all the locals at the tavern aim at Sword with their guns. Sword manages to take all their guns and nearly reaches Sophie, but he is held down by the locals, who allow Phil to escape with Natalia and Sophie. Sword finds his motorcycle chained up and uses it as cover from the locals shooting at him, while Sophie tries to explain that they are wrong, but Phil just dismisses it as Stockholm Syndrome. While Phil tells Natalia to sedate Sophie, but Sophie manages to take Natalia's gun and causes the cruiser to crash. Back at San Del Dios, Sword keeps running from the civilians, who indiscreetly firing at him. Just when Sword was about to be shot, Gina arrived and saves him. Sophie holds both Natalia and Phil at gunpoint, but Bishop appears and allows Phil to be rough since their farce was revealed. Phil knocks Natalia aside and gets closer to Sophie. Sophie threatens to kill herself, but passes out. When she awakes, she finds Sword. Phil transforms into his horror form and battles Sword, but is cut down by Sword at the end. Bishops destroys the town and then retreats, but Gina says it's fine since the town folks are alive trapped in a magical cage that Gina made to stop them from chasing Sword. They then continue towards El Dorado. A man searches for his friend, but the motel manager denies having seen his friend and offers him to stay for the night in a remote motel. While rinsing his face, the man hears the shower suddenly running. When he pulls the curtains, the shower stops and then it glows red. The man then screams and a blood spatter is shown along with his blood falling down the drain. Sword, Gina, and Sophie pass through a ruined city and arrive to a cliff. While Sword complains about having to sleep in a sleeping bag, Sophie spots the same motel. They arrive at the motel and Sophie gets excited about everything inside the room. Sophie spots a teenage boy and goes outside. She meets and befriends George, the son of the owner Matthew, and he explains their current situation. The group have dinner while Matthew arrive and ask them if they are going to El Dorado because there has been a lot of guests then were going there. This makes the group suspicious about him. Matthew's wife finishes showering and asks him to stop working on the finances, but he becomes angry stating that he did all of this for them and starts beating her, all of this while George is teary saying to stop. After Gina and Sophie finish taking a bath, a liquid-based horror attacks them, but Gina stops it and forces it to retreat. Later, Matthew's wife discovers that her husband made a pact with the horror to ensure the family's financial survival. Matthew wishes to return to Russell City and become a success, but instead, the horror engulfs him and then attacks his wife. She is saved by Sword who, together with Gina, attacks and destroys the horror. While discussing about El Dorado, Gina suggests that the group visit Fair Sail de Simo to get more information about it. Once at the small settlement built on islands of woven reeds on a lake in the mountains, Sword and Sophie bounce on the reeds with excitement. Kids gather around Gina excited at her return, but is cut short when the elder tells them about a gun-wielding alchemist and that El Dorado has become a problem. Gina buys many motto tools using huge amounts of money while Sword talks with the elder. At night, the group attend a ceremony to travel to the land of guidance and enter the temple that only appears during a full moon. As Gina undergoes the trial, she easily defeats a pack of wolves, but then a minotaur monster appears. Gina has a hard time fighting the monster in the beginning, but eventually wins and earns a stone of protection using many weapons and spells. The guardian of the temple possesses Mia and tells them about King and the location of El Dorado, a place which lies beyond El Salvados to the southwest. After the guardian warns them about the darkness, Sophie dozes off for a minute while having a vision of her brother calling for help. As they set off, Gina gives the gem to Sophie. Luke arrives in a small settlement after being told by the elder of Fair Sail de Simo that it would be a personal shortcut for him. While wandering around, Luke finds a Makai Alchemist symbol on a door and then meets Stella. Stella's grandpa then opens the door and accidentally hits her. He then sees Stella crying and threatens to beat Luke for making her cry, but it is eventually cleared up. Stella tells him the legend of a demon sealer who sealed a demon nearby many years ago. Apparently, the seal has weakened and the demon is about to awaken with the impending full moon. While taking Luke to the place where a statue of the demon sealer once stood, a group of older women ask if Stella pulled another traveler again, but Stella's grandpa's wheelchair starts to go down the cliff. Stella almost falls trying to save her grandpa, but fortunately Luke saved them both. After locating the sea cave where the demon was sealed with Luke's help, Luke gets a vision of a night that became a horror when he touched the ruins inside. After returning and eating dinner, Stella's grandpa tells Luke why Stella is fascinated with the occult and asks him not to involve her. At the night of the full moon, Luke goes to the cave to prevent the horror from reappearing, but Stella follows him. The powerful horror awakes and Luke tries to fight him with all the weapons at his disposal, but the horror is stronger and Luke's hair is cut short. While recalling how he was once a great Makai Knight like his father, Luke breaks free of the horror's tendrils and unites the will of the spirits of those the demon defeated in the past and manages to destroy it. As he leaves, Luke wipes Stella and her grandpa's memories of the previous night's events. After the people that were chosen to go to El Dorado pass by a town full of poverty, they enter El Dorado. One of them is Bezel, a horror that has infiltrated El Dorado looking for King. While looking for him, Bezel consumes two men and turns them into his clones, but not before being detected by Bishop. After consuming his third victim, Bezel goes to a park and sees the young lady from his bus accepting a free invitation to an exclusive party. Elsewhere, Bishop discusses with Queen about Garo's imminent arrival and King's plans. After going to the party, Carol is chosen along with two other ladies, but she finds out that it's entrapped to provide food for horrors. While running, Carol recognizes Bezel as the guy from her bus and asks him for help, but Bezel then consumes her. The horrors become mad because Bezel interrupted their feast, but he kills them all except for the party's host, all of this while he is being observed remotely by Bishop and Queen. Bezel approaches King's golden tower with the host's directions and uses him to break the tower's barrier. Bezel progresses through the tower until he encounters Queen. Bezel states what he would do in King's place, but Queen disagrees and they fight. Bezel splits into multiple clones, but Queen easily disposes of them using her Makai plants and defeats Bezel. He escapes through a hole he made, but is found out by Bishop, who mocks him through many television screens. Bishop then appears on the other side of the street. Bezel transforms and attacks him, but Bishop dodges it and Knight cuts Bezel in two. Bishop sings happily and goes to check on the creation of horrors with Dr. Stanley. Sword, Gina, and Sophie arrive at a town near the ocean, but Sophie is angry at Sword for eating her chocolate without permission. While Sword goes to the market alone, he buys a box of chocolate for himself and two more for kids that couldn't afford it. Pedro is then seen running away from a couple of thugs as he had gotten himself into trouble. As the young man is knocked down and the two are about to land another blow, Sword catches up and quickly disappears with him before they even notice. Sword wants nothing to do with Pedro, but he goes with him in the end because Pedro mentioned a good woman in a restaurant. At the place, Sword gets disappointed by the good woman Pedro mentioned and witnesses people making fun of Pedro for being a crybaby and for foolishly attempt to get revenge on Gordon. At the hotel, Sophie receives the Stone of Protection from the Land of Guidance from Gina. Pedro asks for Sword's help, but Sword refuses as he uses the death of his own sister to show him that if he died, who will remember her. After leaving Pedro's home, Sword stands on the beach and recalls the death of his sister and how it was living with her. Pedro again gets beaten up, and Sword again rescues him, scaring off the gang members. Pedro then seizes this opportunity to pick up a gun and point it to Gordon, but doesn't shoot because the charm Monica gave him breaks, telling him not to do it, and Pedro bursts down in tears. Gordon escapes, but he hits a truck carrying pigs and all the pigs escape and step on his face. As they prepare to leave the town, Sword gives Sophie the box of chocolate he bought earlier and she shares it with the three of them, making her happy. As the group sit at Chiaki's gas station, an eclipse suddenly blocks the sun and a battalion of monster truck horrors appear. Sword attacks them and sends Gina and Sophie to another route using the car. Sword then transforms and destroys many horrors along with his Zaruba-controlled motorcycle, causing Bishop to flee from the horror he was riding. Bishop then follows Gina and Sophie with a wave of sesmes that fold into projectiles and attack the car. Gina accelerates the car quickly enough for the Gatling gun on the rear to be in position, and Sophie uses it to destroy most of the sesmes. Two sesmes almost catch Sophie, but Luke arrives just in time, destroying the remaining horrors and breaking the eclipse barrier. Suddenly a new horror, Salkin, emerges from below the ground and causes the car to flip while hands appear from a portal to capture Sophie. Sword rescues Sophie and then Zaruba carries her away to safety on the motorcycle. Sophie cries for all the trouble she has caused her friends, but Zaruba tells her to keep moving forward. They are eventually caught by Night, but Zaruba sacrifices himself and rams the motorcycle into Night, causing an explosion. Gina and Luke catch up with Sophie, and Sword absorbs the remaining power of Zaruba. A newly upgraded Garo battles Balg and causes powerful shockwaves. However, after testing Sword's powers, Night withdraws from the battle and leaves Sophie and the others to mourn the loss of Zaruba. As Sword, Gina, Sophie, and Luke approach El Dorado, Gina tells them she is going back to the Land of Guidance to restock since the last attack destroyed her weapon inventory. Once at the gate, Luke uses his memory erasing rain on the guards to sneak into El Dorado. Sword, Luke, and Sophie eventually find a base of operations and Luke uses a protection charm on it. As per orders from the Watchdog Center, the group sets out to find the real identity of King. They explore the city at night and Sword tries out the variety of technology developed by the Gar-Eden Corporation. After eating in a diner and separating from Luke, Sophie enters the Eldonet virtual world and finds out that the people there do not mind if one or two of their friends disappear as long as there is happiness. But then she meets a suspicious avatar that mentions the Golden Knight and receives a letter. In the club Hemrio once managed, Luke learns that horrors gathered there regularly. Once Luke is back, Sword holds a map where they suspect horrors gather to eat people. Luke asks if Sword and Sophie found out anything and Sword shows Luke the invitation Sophie received. Suspecting it to be a trap, Sword, Luke, and Sophie go to a mall in construction where they are met by a drone. After following the drone, the group meets a former employee of Gar-Eden Corporation who reveals that El Dorado is run by horrors who use it as a feeding ground and how he found out about it suddenly. His hideout is attacked by assault horrors and they flee while Sword encounters some of them. After realizing that he did nothing more than hide, the man transfers his data to Sophie's cell phone in case something happens to him. After the backup completes, Sophie sees the silhouette of a woman for a short while and then the cameras activates. Sophie then helps Luke track the approaching horrors by revealing their location. Sophie then turns on all the lights and Luke finishes off most of the horrors, but a muscular one catches Luke by surprise and was about to throw him down. Fortunately, Garo arrives and cuts down the Norma and saves Luke from the fall. On one of the files, Sophie discovers that her brother, Martin Hens, is the programmer involved with the true El Dorado. In the end, they help the man escape through the docks and Luke tells him to use his motorcycle that is parked in the slums near the entrance of El Dorado, while Sword tells him to go to Fei Long's restaurant later. Luke asks Sophie how she knew where the horrors were and she says a girl told her. The group is left with even more unanswered questions. Bishop and Queen discuss and agree on capturing Sophie as per King's orders. Sophie researches the Gar-Eden Corporation and finds that it was once a small company that merged with Cygnus Ram Tech 10 years ago, a company that Sword seems to remember. After eating out in a restaurant, Sword meets Sophie in their hideout and she thanks him for all the things he has done for her. Luke then appears with a problem. Makai plants have infested the Tower of El Dorado and started eating the human workers. The group saves a survivor and encounter Queen while looking for more survivors. Queen uses the carnivorous plants to attack them while the survivor reveals himself as the Dr. Stanley and abducts Sophie. The doctor brings her to the place where the true El Dorado is and tells her his past, but she uses this chance to escape. While looking for an exit, Sophie finds a door with the name of her brother and enters. Inside the office, Sophie cries after reading her brother's diary because he thought about her after all this time, but then she finds the fake letters that Sophie sent him. Sophie is caught again by Stanley and Queen. While walking towards the true El Dorado, Sophie sees a lot of dead people that were once citizens of El Dorado inside huge tubes. Suddenly, Sword and Luke find her using a tracker in her neck. Luke stays back to hold off Queen while Sword goes after Stanley. Sword manages to knock down the doctor and save Sophie, but Bishop arrives and throws them a baby-sized Stanley with an explosive charge in his mouth. After Sword faints protecting Sophie from the blast, Bishop drags and sends her to the true El Dorado, with Sword following after her. Sophie wakes up back at home where she finds her brother outside, and Sword wakes up to find a young lady. Inside the true El Dorado, Martin reveals to Sophie that it is a world he created as an utopia. Elsewhere, Sword questions the authenticity of the Lizzie in front of him, but she acknowledges she cannot prove she is the real Lizzie and tells him she's only there to supply him with information. Meanwhile, on the outside, Luke carries Sword's unconscious body to a hallway where he encounters Gina. Martin presents Queen as his secretary to Sophie, not knowing that she is a horror and that she has already met Sophie before. Since a person retains their senses inside El Dorado, Martin creates a vending machine that creates an ice cream for Sophie. While the people inside of El Dorado congratulates Martin for bringing Sophie and for the near completion of the true El Dorado, Sophie discovers that her brother is the king of El Dorado that has caused her so much pain. Back at Lizzie's place, Lizzie tells Sword that the people there are actually the souls of people who have died and have been captured. She explains that an ancient horror infiltrated Cygnus Ram Tech after learning of their brain research and completed the theory of EldoNet. However, his plan was discovered by the Makai Knights. After a fierce battle with them, the horror self-destructed the facility, and unbeknownst to everyone, he survived along with the prototype of EldoNet. Suddenly, the people outside turn into mechanical spiders and attack them. Lizzie then asks Sword to save Sophie and destroy El Dorado. Meanwhile, Sophie reveals Martin that it has already been 3 years since he disappeared and not half a year like he thought, and that the outside city of El Dorado is run by horrors. Unaware that thousands died as a result of El Dorado, Martin dismisses Sophie's warnings as brainwashing from a rival corporation. After successfully escaping from the horde of horrors, Lizzie asks Sword to destroy the horror and free all the souls inside the true El Dorado. While Martin tells Sophie how much people have joined the true El Dorado since the alpha testing, Lizzie successfully appears and grabs hold of Sophie while Sword is descending towards them. Queen appears and attacks Sword until she restrains him, but Lizzie comes and sends Sword back to the real world. After Sophie sees Martin's demonic shadow, she attempts to kill him by throwing both of them off the platform. Awakening in the real world, Sophie tries to strangle Martin, but he resists and they both fall from the stairs. Martin eventually sees the dead bodies of the sacrificed people while a tearful Sophie strangles her brother. In a flashback, Martin and Sophie are orphaned and wait inside while 4 men in black discuss about what to do with them. The flashback then changes to Martin promising to protect Sophie and create a world where everyone can live happily without difficulties. Back in the present, Sophie shows Martin the people who died because of him and tearfully strangles him. Elsewhere, Queen wakes up from the true El Dorado and questions Bishop if he really killed Sword like he was ordered to or not. Sophie mistakenly believes Martin is a horror because of all the lives he sacrificed for her sake and tries to kill him before Sword comes and does it, but Martin escapes from Sophie scared and confused. Meanwhile, Sword, Luke and Gina drive towards El Dorado, but Queen attacks them using her Makai plants before a strange frequency turns the citizens into horrors. In order to save Sophie, Sword manages to run past Queen and leaves the others to fight Queen. Martin tries to contact Queen, Bishop, and Knight for assistance to no avail. Martin then recalls when he was first approached by Queen and after that when he started working for the Gar-Eden Corporation. Outside, Gina evacuates the remaining people of El Dorado while Luke unsuccessfully tries to take Queen down. Inside the tower, Martin proceeds to the exit, but he is too emotionally distraught and King takes advantage of this and dives him further into darkness. Queen is unaffected by Luke's attack, but thanks to a sniper shot from Gina, the bullets collide and create a magical barrage that greatly injures Queen. Luke aims and tries to finish her off, but Queen manages to escape. A mentally unstable Martin finds Sophie and drives her out before the Madu ring consumes him and turns him into a horror that reveals Martin's miserable face on its chest. While watching the situation through the cameras, Bishop points out that King sure took his time. Back at the entrance, King reveals Sophie that it's her fault that her brother turned into a horror as Sword arrives. Martin tries to crawl out from King's abdomen, but he is pulled back by King as Sophie watches in horror. Martin's hand tries to escape again, But this time King eats his hand and then attacks Sword and Sophie. Sword and Sophie manage to escape while King turns the city's lights red and remotely collapses the buildings. As Luke and Gina part their ways after agreeing on evacuating the remaining people, Gina hears a motorcycle and remarks that he's here. After running away for a while, Sword and Sophie are finally surrounded by red gargoyle horrors, but the motorcycle arrives and reveals a newly rebuilt Zaruba. Sword and Sophie manage to escape from El Dorado along with the remaining people and Luke and Gina behind them. Gina hugs a depressed Sophie and Sword reveals to Gina and Luke that King used her to get to Martin, with Luke pointing out that there's no reason to involve Sophie anymore. King commences his plan and people around the world lose consciousness. Nearby TVs turn on and Lizzie alerts Sword and the group that King is already forcing souls into ELDOnet and that Sophie is the only person that can stop him. After Zaruba talks to Sophie and convinces her to help them, Sword and Sophie get on Zaruba while Gina kisses Sword. They are then attacked by Knight, but Luke and Gina tell them to go on while they stay to fight Knight and the newly arrived Queen. Sword and Sophie burst back into the chamber where the true El Dorado and forcibly enter inside it. Inside, they see corpses floating in the sky and Lizzie tells them it is because of King, but then they are surrounded by the guard bots. Back in the outside world, Luke and Gina fight their respective opponent. Sword and Zaruba stay to fight while Lizzie and Sophie go to the terminal in order to shut ELDOnet down. Luke and Knight fight, with the latter remarking that Luke's inability to cut his past is his limit. Sophie manages to activate the terminal, but 3 gigantic eel horrors appear and attack Sword. As more of them appear, Sword transforms along with Zaruba, but while trying to dodge them, they are sucked inside of King, a colorless void where the souls King took are. Back with Lizzie and Sophie, the terminal starts creating electricity and hurts Sophie while Bishop attempts to stop them with the guard bots, but Lizzie activates a defensive barrier. Luke fights the best he can, but he is eventually stabbed by Knight in his shoulder. Gina and Queen also fight, but Queen suddenly reveals her horror form. Back with Sword unconscious body, King comments how they never change, that no matter which era they are on or how many times he crushes them, they always pop up like pestilent insects and fight back. Sophie attempts to shut down the terminal again, but Lizzie tells her that if she keeps interacting with it, she will disappear. Sword gets up and a surprised King asks how, something to which Sword replies because that's what it means to live, while showing how all the people he met throughout his journey recovered from their suffering. Luke and Gina fight with everything they have in a first battle and eventually defeat their opponents. Sword and Zaruba fight against King and his horde of digital puppets and are successful in escaping. By combining his Garo with Zaruba, he uses the sword and cuts down King. Sophie struggles to destroy the ELDOnet storage unit, but when one of her tears falls on her stone of protection, she sees Martin and a younger version of herself and eventually receives the password, "Everything is for my sister." ELDOnet begins to disappear and Lizzie says her goodbye to Sophie while Knight spares Luke. But as Sword exits King's void, he is intercepted by Knight wearing his Makai armor. They two of them fight fiercely and their ideals clash. Finally, Sword defeats Knight, who pulls the Garo deeper into his body, ending his life and destroying the corrupted bulb. Outside, Sophie asks why Sword hasn't come back yet, but Gina and Luke remain quiet. Sophie tries to go back in, but she is stopped by Gina and starts crying. Luke then approaches them and uses one of his magical bullets and erases Sophie's memories. A year has passed since the defeat of King. Sophie was returned to the orphanage and resumed her teenage life. She is about 15 years old and life hasn't been entirely the same. Although her memories has been erased, her heart and mind has always felt as if she was missing something very important. Throughout this time, she would space out and experience feelings of missing someone or something important. Sword. One day, during Christmas, Sophie cut her finger and the sight of blood triggered her memories. As soon as Sophie remembered, she ran into her closet to search for her own hoodie she had worn during her travels with Sword. She was happy to find it and rediscover the pendant Gina gifted her earlier. Now fully awakened, she ran off to find Sword. Sophie ran through the snow, desperate to see Sword. She made it back to the diner to find Gina there. Gina, glad to know Sophie remembers their history, and Sophie expressed great desire to become an alchemist herself. Garm and Gina welcomed Sophie into the fold and expressed great excitement to see Sword again. Although surprised to see Sophie, his stomach was still hurt him and he went back to poop. This is the end of the video, so please watching all of my anime recap series. Thanks for watching.